The fastest way to lose $1 billion is to forget who helped you build the first dollar. 10 minutes before history was supposed to belong to Ethan Blackwell, the lights inside the Aurora Dome glowed like a second sunrise over Las Vegas. Every seat was filled. Every aisle was crowded. Every camera lens pointed toward the massive stage wrapped in silver screens and floating holographic displays. The low hum of thousands of voices blended with the distant pulse of music vibrating through the floor. Journalists adjusted microphones. Investors checked their phones. Industry leaders exchanged confident smiles beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected shards of white light across the room. Tonight was not supposed to be just another product launch. Tonight was supposed to be the moment Ethan Blackwell became untouchable. Above the stage, a giant digital clock counted down the final 10 minutes before the unveiling of Nexus 1. The artificial intelligence platform analysts were already calling the most important technology breakthrough of the decade. The numbers glowed bright blue against the darkness. 10 minutes, 9 minutes and 59 seconds, 9 minutes and 58 seconds. The anticipation was almost physical. You could feel it moving through the crowd like electricity. At 38 years old, Ethan Blackwell had become the face of American innovation. Magazine covers called him a visionary. News anchors called him the future. Investors called him a genius. His company, Blackwell Dynamics, had climbed from a small startup into a technology empire valued at more than $40 billion. Tonight, industry experts predicted that number could double. Backstage, Ethan stood alone for a moment beneath the soft glow of production lights. His tailored charcoal suit fit perfectly. His silver watch reflected the countdown clock hanging above the entrance tunnel. Assistants moved around him carrying tablets and schedules. Security personnel spoke quietly into earpieces. Producers rushed between stations making final adjustments. Yet Ethan appeared completely calm. Years of boardrooms, interviews, negotiations, and public appearances had taught him how to control every expression, every gesture, every word. He glanced toward the monitor, showing the audience waiting beyond the curtain. Thousands of faces stared toward the stage. Thousands more watched from live streams across the country. In less than 10 minutes, he would walk into that light. In less than 10 minutes, Nexus 1 would be revealed. In less than 10 minutes, another chapter of his legacy would begin. A young assistant approached him with a tablet. Final market projections just came in, she said. Analysts expect the stock to jump 23% tomorrow morning. Ethan barely looked at the screen. Good, he answered. His voice remained steady and measured. The assistant nodded and hurried away. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his jacket and looked back toward the stage entrance. He should have felt excited. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, something he couldn't explain lingered in the back of his mind. A strange weight. Small, almost invisible, like a shadow standing just outside the reach of the spotlight. The countdown clock continued its march. 8 minutes. Across the enormous hall, guests settled deeper into their seats. Reporters prepared opening remarks for broadcasts. Camera operators rehearsed movements. The giant screens displayed highlights from Blackwell Dynamics' rise to dominance. Images flashed across the room. Company milestones, product launches, investor celebrations. Ethan shaking hands with world leaders. Ethan speaking at global conferences. Ethan standing alone at the center of every victory. Nobody questioned the story. Nobody questioned the images. Nobody questioned the name attached to the success. Near the very back of the auditorium, hidden beyond the clusters of investors, those who glanced her way saw nothing unusual. Just another attendee waiting for the presentation to begin. But while thousands of people had traveled to Las Vegas hoping to witness history being made, she had come for an entirely different reason. Her name was Nia Brooks. 5 years ago, she had stood beside Ethan Blackwell before the magazines, before the investors, before the billion-dollar valuations. 5 years ago, she had believed they were building a future together. Now she sat alone beneath the glow of the countdown clock while the man she once trusted prepared to step onto the largest stage of his life. 7 minutes remained. The crowd erupted into applause as music swelled through the speakers. Ethan's image appeared across every screen in the arena. The host walked confidently onto the stage and raised a hand toward the audience. More cheers followed. More cameras activated. More phones lifted into the air. Nobody noticed that Nia's eyes never left the stage. Nobody noticed the thin leather folder resting quietly beside her chair. Nobody noticed the calm expression on her face. Because if they had, they might have understood something Ethan Blackwell did not. Tonight was not the night his empire would reach its greatest height. Tonight was the night the truth finally arrived. Nia Brooks had not come to Las Vegas to be noticed. For 5 years, she had become very good at disappearing. The countdown clock above the stage slipped from 7 minutes to 6, its blue numbers glowing across the darkened auditorium while applause echoed from every corner of the room. On the giant screens, Ethan Blackwell smiled beside investors, shook hands with politicians, and accepted awards beneath flashing cameras. The audience watched the highlights with admiration. Nia watched them with memory. She remembered a different room. A smaller room. A cramped garage outside Austin, Texas, where summer heat turned the air thick and the old ceiling fan barely worked. Back then there were no investors. No private jets. No magazine covers. There had only been 2 folding tables, 3 aging computers, and 2 people stubborn enough to believe they could build something extraordinary. Ethan had been 29. Nia had been 27. Neither had much money. Some weeks they lived on takeout sandwiches and coffee. Other weeks they slept only 4 hours a night because every hour mattered. The dream had felt larger than exhaustion, larger than uncertainty, larger than fear. Nia could still see Ethan leaning over a whiteboard covered in equations while sunlight spilled through dusty windows. He would pace when he thought, talk with his hands, fill entire walls with ideas before erasing everything and starting again. When investors rejected them, he always found another door to knock on. When prototypes failed, he stayed until sunrise looking for answers. He had been relentless. She had admired that about him. More than that, she had trusted him. The technology everyone would celebrate tonight had not appeared in a boardroom. It had not emerged from a billion-dollar research facility. It had started in that garage, long before Blackwell Dynamics existed, long before analysts predicted fortunes, long before reporters called Ethan a genius. Nia remembered the night the breakthrough finally happened. Rain hammered against the roof while code scrolled endlessly across multiple screens. It was nearly 2 in the morning when the system responded in a way neither of them expected. For several seconds they simply stared. Ethan looked at the monitor. Nia looked at the monitor. Then both realized what they were seeing. The architecture worked. The adaptive learning model functioned exactly as they had hoped. The foundation was real. Ethan had laughed first. A loud, disbelieving laugh. Nia remembered laughing too. The kind of laughter that comes when months of frustration suddenly collapse into relief. They celebrated with cold pizza and convenience store coffee because that was all they could afford. Yet it felt like a feast. They believed they had changed their future forever. Maybe they had, just not in the way Nia expected. The host's voice pulled the audience back to the present. More cheers erupted across the arena. Nia's attention returned to the stage. Ethan appeared backstage on one of the production monitors. Calm, controlled, prepared, exactly as the world expected him to be. 5 years ago he had looked different. Not physically. The same sharp jawline. The same focused eyes. But there had been something softer then. Something human beneath the ambition. At least she thought there had been. The first major investor arrived 8 months after the breakthrough. Nia remembered every detail of that meeting. The expensive conference room. The polished glass table. The view overlooking downtown Austin. She remembered how excited Ethan had been driving there. He talked about growth, expansion, hiring engineers, building a company that could compete with the biggest names in Silicon Valley. Nia believed every word because she shared the same dream. The meeting lasted almost 4 hours. When it ended, the investors seemed impressed, optimistic, interested. It should have been one of the happiest days of their lives. Instead, it became the beginning of something neither of them fully understood at the time. A week later, Ethan began traveling more often. New meetings appeared on his calendar. New advisors entered the picture. New consultants started offering opinions about branding, leadership, and marketability. At first, Nia ignored it. Growth required change. She understood that. Success brought new challenges. She understood that too. But gradually something shifted. Phone calls became shorter. Conversations became more formal. Decisions happened without her knowledge. Little things at first, then larger ones. The distance arrived slowly enough that she questioned whether it was real. Yet every month it grew harder to deny. Across the auditorium, Another burst of applause rolled through the crowd. The countdown clock now showed 5 minutes remaining. Nia lowered her gaze toward the leather folder resting beside her chair. Her fingers brushed the edge of it briefly before pulling away. Inside sat documents that had waited years for this moment. Years for this room. Years for these witnesses. On stage, the screens displayed the words "The future starts now." Thousands of people cheered. Nia looked up at the slogan and felt a quiet sadness settle in her chest. Because 5 years ago, she had believed those words too. And 5 years ago, she never imagined the future would arrive with her sitting alone in the last row while the man she once built everything beside prepared to meet the truth. 4 minutes and 32 seconds remained on the countdown clock. The giant blue numbers glowed above the stage while anticipation continued building inside the Aurora Dome. The audience had no idea that the future they were celebrating had been shaped by decisions made years earlier behind closed conference room doors. Nia remembered the exact day she first realized she was no longer being treated like a partner. It started with an email. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just a meeting invitation she should have received, but did not. She discovered it by accident when one of the engineers mentioned a strategic planning session scheduled for later that afternoon. At first, she assumed it was a mistake. Startups moved fast. Oversights happened. She told herself not to overthink it. But then another meeting happened without her. Then another. Soon there were entire conversations taking place beyond her reach. Whenever she asked Ethan about them, he always had an answer. Investors wanted efficiency. Advisors wanted streamlined communication. Consultants recommended restructuring leadership responsibilities. The explanations sounded reasonable when viewed individually. Together, they formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. One evening, she arrived at headquarters after spending 14 hours refining a major software architecture update. The office was nearly empty. Most employees had already gone home. Through the glass walls of a conference room, she spotted Ethan speaking with 2 investors she had never met. She was about to walk in when she heard one of them say something that stopped her cold. "The technology is exceptional," the investor said. "But the company needs a face the market can rally around." Ethan remained silent. The investor continued. "Investors buy confidence. Customers buy stories. Media buys personalities. Right now, Blackwell Dynamics has one obvious public leader." Nia stood frozen outside the room. The city lights reflected against the glass, making it difficult to see every expression clearly. Yet she could see enough. Ethan listened carefully. The investor leaned forward. "You are the brand, Ethan. You are the founder people remember." Founder. Singular. Not founders. The distinction landed heavier than she expected. Another advisor nodded in agreement. Public messaging works best when leadership is simple. One vision. One voice. One story. Ethan still said nothing. That silence stayed with Nia longer than any words could have. For years they had built everything together. Every breakthrough. Every setback. Every impossible deadline. Yet as she stood outside that conference room, she began to understand something uncomfortable. The story being sold to investors no longer included her. 3 months later, Blackwell Dynamics secured its largest funding round. The company exploded almost overnight. New employees arrived every week. Entire floors of office space were leased. Media requests poured in. Industry publications started profiling Ethan as one of the fastest rising entrepreneurs in America. Nia appeared in a few early articles, then fewer, then none at all. The shift happened gradually enough that most people never noticed. Ethan became the face on every magazine cover. Ethan delivered every keynote speech. Ethan appeared on every panel discussion. Ethan accepted every award. Sometimes Nia watched interviews online after returning home late at night. Reporters would ask about the origins of the company. Ethan always mentioned long hours, sacrifice, vision, determination. Yet somehow her name appeared less and less with each retelling. Eventually, it disappeared entirely. Back in the present, another wave of applause rolled through the arena. The host stood center stage discussing the revolutionary impact Nexus One would have on industries across the world. The crowd listened with fascination. Nia remained still. 3 minutes and 57 seconds remained. She looked around the room. Many of the investors seated near the front had never met her. Some probably did not even know she existed. To them, Blackwell Dynamics had always been Ethan's company. His dream. His invention. His achievement. The narrative had become so polished that nobody questioned it anymore. But Nia remembered the final meeting, the one that changed everything. It happened 5 years earlier in a sleek conference room overlooking downtown San Francisco. By then, Blackwell Dynamics was already becoming a major player. Ethan had flown in for negotiations with a group of venture capital executives. Nia arrived expecting a discussion about expansion. Instead, she found legal documents waiting on the table. Thick documents. Dozens of pages. She remembered the polished wood surface beneath her hands. The cold bottle of water sitting untouched beside her chair. The tension in Ethan's eyes. He could barely hold her gaze. An attorney explained the proposal. Corporate restructuring. Leadership optimization. Intellectual property consolidation. The language sounded technical. Professional. Carefully sanitized. Yet beneath the legal terminology was a simple truth. The company would move forward under a new ownership structure. Public records would identify Ethan as the primary inventor associated with the core technology. Certain patents would be reassigned. Certain credits would be modified. Certain names would disappear. Nia remembered staring at the paperwork in disbelief. "You knew about this?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked away before answering. That single movement told her everything she needed to know. The attorney continued speaking. Investors believed the arrangement would improve market confidence. Growth opportunities would increase. Future acquisitions would become easier. Shareholder value would benefit. The words kept coming. Yet Nia barely heard them. Because in that moment, she realized the company she helped build was no longer asking for her contribution. It was asking for her absence. The countdown clock above the stage slipped below 3 minutes. Thousands of eyes remained fixed on the future. Nobody noticed the woman in the final row quietly remembering the day she was erased from the story. And nobody knew that in less than 3 minutes, the story was about to remember her. The attorney had continued speaking that afternoon in San Francisco as though the proposal sitting on the table was merely a business adjustment. Numbers filled the presentation screen behind him. Growth forecasts, market projections, investor confidence metrics. Every chart pointed upward. Every slide promised a larger future. Yet none of them explained why Nia Brooks was being asked to surrender the work she had spent years creating. She remembered the sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city skyline shimmered beyond the glass while expensive cars moved like tiny pieces across distant streets. Everything in that room projected success. Everything except the look in Ethan's eyes. He avoided hers. Again and again. That hurt more than the documents themselves. Because if he truly believed the decision was right, why could he not meet her gaze? Nia turned another page. Then another. The language remained carefully constructed. She would retain a financial stake. She would receive compensation. She would benefit from future growth. The attorneys described it as a strategic transition, a necessary evolution, a small sacrifice for a much larger vision. Nia finally closed the folder. "Tell me the truth," she said quietly. The room fell silent. Even the attorney stopped speaking. Her attention never left Ethan. "Do you agree with this?" For several seconds, nobody moved. The city stretched endlessly beyond the windows. The distant sound of traffic drifted upward from the streets below. Ethan folded his hands together. "The investors believe it is the best path forward." It was not an answer. Nia knew it. He knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. "That is not what I asked." Her voice remained calm. She was not angry. Not yet. She simply wanted honesty. Ethan exhaled slowly. "The company is bigger than either of us now." Those words changed everything. Because they told her exactly where she stood. Not beside him. Behind him. Somewhere along the way, the dream they built together had become something he believed belonged primarily to him. The attorneys resumed talking. They discussed opportunities, valuation increases, future expansion plans. But Nia had already stopped listening. She gathered her things, stood from her chair, and walked toward the door. Ethan called her name once. She paused, but did not turn around. "Nia." His voice carried something uncertain. Regret perhaps. Fear perhaps. She never discovered which. "I hope this works out for you," she said softly before leaving. Those were the last words she spoke to him in person for almost 5 years. Back in Las Vegas, the countdown clock dropped beneath 2 minutes. The audience remained captivated by the spectacle unfolding around them. Music swelled through hidden speakers. Massive screens displayed cinematic videos celebrating innovation and progress. Investors smiled. Reporters prepared headlines. Across the room, hundreds of phone screens glowed in anticipation. Nia sat motionless. The leather folder remained beside her chair. 5 years had passed since San Francisco. 5 years since she walked away from Blackwell Dynamics. Many people assumed she disappeared after leaving the company. That assumption suited her. It made things easier. Nobody looked for someone they believed was gone. What nobody knew was that she never stopped working. The day after leaving San Francisco, she rented a small office above a hardware store in Denver. The building was old. The elevator barely worked. The carpet needed replacing. Yet for the first time in months, she felt something unexpected. Relief. There were no investors telling her who she needed to become. No consultants rewriting history. No attorneys explaining why her contributions should be minimized. There was only silence. Space. Freedom. She spent the next several years doing what she had always done best. Building. Learning. Creating. While Blackwell Dynamics expanded into a corporate giant, Nia quietly continued developing technology of her own. She filed patents, published research, consulted for universities and private laboratories. She never chased publicity, never appeared on magazine covers, never competed for headlines. The work itself mattered more than recognition. Yet throughout those years, one question remained unanswered. Why had Ethan allowed it to happen? Investors could pressure, advisors could influence, lawyers could draft paperwork, but someone still had to sign. Someone still had to choose. That question stayed with her longer than she cared to admit. There were nights she replayed old memories trying to identify the exact moment everything changed. Sometimes she wondered whether ambition transformed him. Other times she wondered if the signs had always been there and she simply failed to see them. Eventually she stopped searching for explanations. Understanding would not change the outcome. Acceptance became easier than answers. On stage, the host's voice rose dramatically as the crowd erupted once more. Ladies and gentlemen, the moment has arrived. Thunderous applause shook the auditorium. The giant countdown clock showed 1 minute remaining. Backstage, Ethan prepared to enter. Production crews moved into position. Cameras aligned toward the center platform. The atmosphere felt electric, historic, unstoppable. Nia looked toward the stage entrance where he would appear. 5 years ago, she might have felt bitterness. 5 years ago, she might have wanted revenge. But those emotions had long since faded. What remained was something simpler. Truth. The folder beside her chair contained documents that could not be argued with. Dates, signatures, patent filings, records, facts. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just evidence. And evidence had a way of surviving even when people tried to erase it. The lights inside the arena suddenly dimmed. Thousands of conversations disappeared into silence. The giant screens turned black. 1 minute remained before the future was unveiled. And for the first time all evening, Nia Brooks reached down and picked up the folder. The final 60 seconds vanished quickly. A deep musical note rolled through the arena as darkness settled across the audience. Thousands of people instinctively leaned forward. The giant screens flickered to life, displaying a single glowing symbol suspended against a black background. Then the symbol expanded. Light poured across the stage. The crowd erupted into applause before anyone had even spoken a word. Backstage, Ethan Blackwell stepped toward the entrance tunnel. A production manager counted down beside him. 30 seconds. 29. 28. Every movement around him became precise. Rehearsed. Controlled. Security personnel adjusted positions. Camera operators moved into alignment. Assistants checked final cues on tablets. Ethan's expression never changed. To the world watching, this was another victory waiting to happen. Yet as he approached the stage, an unexpected thought crossed his mind. A memory. Brief. Uninvited. He remembered a small office years earlier. A whiteboard covered in equations. A woman arguing passionately over a design flaw nobody else had noticed. Nia. The memory disappeared almost immediately, swallowed by the noise of the present. 20 seconds remained. Out in the audience, Nia stood slowly from her seat. The movement was so ordinary that nobody nearby paid attention. People remained focused on the stage, on the countdown, on history. She picked up the leather folder and held it calmly at her side. Her pulse remained steady. Her breathing remained steady. 5 years had given her plenty of time to prepare for this moment. Not emotionally. Logistically. Every document had been verified. Every filing authenticated. Every date confirmed. She had spent years making certain that when the truth finally arrived, it would arrive carrying facts instead of anger. 15 seconds. The host's voice echoed through the arena. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Blackwell Dynamics, Ethan Blackwell. The response was immediate. Thunderous applause crashed through the auditorium. Hundreds of phones lifted into the air. Cameras flashed from every direction. Ethan stepped into the light. The crowd rose to its feet. Investors cheered. Journalists smiled. Employees standing near the stage applauded proudly. On the giant screens, his image appeared 50 feet tall. He raised a hand in acknowledgement. Confident, polished, untouchable. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire room belonged to him. Then something unexpected happened. Near the rear of the auditorium, Nia began walking. Her pace was unhurried. Her expression remained calm. Most people still did not notice. Why would they? One woman crossing an aisle hardly mattered compared to the spectacle unfolding on stage. Ethan reached the center platform. Applause continued rolling through the arena like distant thunder. "Thank you," he began. His voice carried effortlessly through the speakers. 5 years ago, we imagined a future that many people believed was impossible. More applause followed. Nia continued walking. One aisle, then another. Her heels made almost no sound against the carpet. The leather folder remained tucked beneath her arm. "Tonight," Ethan continued, "we are proud to reveal technology that will redefine how people interact with intelligence itself." The giant screens illuminated with dazzling animations. Audience members stared upward in fascination. Nia moved closer. A few attendees glanced her way, then looked back toward the stage. Nobody recognized her. Not yet. Ethan smiled. The practiced smile that had appeared on magazine covers and financial news broadcasts for years. Innovation belongs to those willing to dream beyond limitations. The audience applauded again. Nia reached the center aisle. This time, several security personnel noticed her movement. One exchanged a quick glance with another. She did not appear threatening. She was not rushing. She was not causing a disturbance. She simply continued forward with quiet certainty. Ethan advanced through the presentation. Behind him, graphics displayed growth statistics, market forecasts, and technological achievements. Every number reinforced the same message: success, dominance, vision. Yet down on the floor, something subtle had begun to change. A few reporters noticed the woman approaching the front. One camera operator briefly shifted focus. An investor in the second row turned around curiously. Nia kept walking. Her eyes never left the stage. Ethan remained unaware. He spoke about the future, about possibility, about transformation. Then he paused dramatically and spread his arms toward the audience. "Tonight," he said, "you are about to witness the next chapter." The lights brightened. The music swelled. The audience leaned forward once more. And at that exact moment, Nia Brooks reached the stairs leading directly to the stage. For a fraction of a second, nobody reacted. The music continued. The lights continued sweeping across the audience. Ethan remained center stage beneath a storm of applause while Nia stood at the bottom of the staircase leading upward. A security guard moved toward her instinctively, then slowed. She was not causing a scene. She was not shouting. She was not demanding attention. She simply looked at the stage with the calm confidence of someone who already knew where she belonged. The guard hesitated. Another member of the event staff approached. "Ma'am, this area is restricted," he said quietly. Nia nodded politely. "I know." Her voice remained steady. "Please tell Ethan Blackwell that Nia Brooks is here." The staff member blinked. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether he had heard correctly. The name meant nothing to him. But several people standing nearby reacted differently. One older investor seated near the front turned his head sharply. A journalist lowered her phone. A man from Blackwell Dynamics froze halfway through a conversation. Nia Brooks. The name still existed in places most people had forgotten to look. On stage, Ethan continued speaking. Technology is not simply about what we create. It is about what we leave behind for future generations. More applause followed. Yet something felt different now. Small pockets of attention were shifting away from the presentation. Whispers began moving through the first few rows. A camera operator glanced toward the staircase. Another followed his gaze. The production manager backstage noticed movement on a monitor and spoke quietly into his headset. Ethan caught the brief distraction out of the corner of his eye. His attention drifted toward the edge of the stage. At first, he saw only a woman standing near the stairs. Then recognition struck him like a sudden change in weather. He stopped speaking. Not dramatically. Not long enough for most people to notice immediately. Just a brief interruption. Half a second. Maybe one full second. But it happened. The audience sensed it. Ethan stared. The bright stage lights reflected in his eyes. 5 years disappeared in an instant. Nia stood exactly where he could see her. Calm. Composed. Holding the leather folder beneath one arm. She did not smile. She did not look angry. Somehow that made the moment even more unsettling. The host glanced toward Ethan, confused by the unexpected pause. Thousands of audience members remained unaware of what was happening. Yet the front rows were beginning to notice. The whispers grew louder. Ethan swallowed once and recovered. Years of public appearances had taught him how to maintain control. "Excuse me for a moment," he said with a polite smile. The crowd chuckled lightly. Most assumed it was a technical adjustment. Ethan stepped away from center stage and moved toward the side. Security personnel immediately started forward. Nia raised one hand gently. "I am not here to interrupt your event," she said. Her voice was not amplified, yet those closest heard every word. "I am here because something belongs in the story." Ethan stopped several feet away from her. The distance felt larger than 5 years. Around them, dozens of cameras had quietly shifted direction. Reporters sensed something unusual unfolding. Investors exchanged uncertain glances. One executive from Blackwell Dynamics looked visibly pale. Ethan's voice emerged carefully measured. "Nia." It was the first time he had spoken her name in years. She nodded once. "Hello, Ethan." The simplicity of the greeting somehow made the moment heavier. No accusation. No confrontation. No drama. Just two people standing on opposite sides of a truth that had waited a very long time. The audience had begun noticing now. Conversations faded. More heads turned toward the side of the stage. The giant screens still displayed promotional graphics, unaware that the real story had shifted elsewhere. Ethan glanced briefly toward the folder. He knew exactly what it was, or at least he suspected. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "This is not the place," he said quietly. Nia's expression never changed. "Actually," she replied, "this is exactly the place." The words landed softly, yet they carried through the growing silence. Nearby microphones captured enough for reporters to hear. Phones lifted higher into the air. Livestream viewers began flooding comment sections with questions. Who was she? Why had Ethan stopped speaking? Why did the atmosphere suddenly feel different? Nia took one step upward onto the first stair. Security looked toward Ethan for instruction. He said nothing, because deep down, he understood something before anyone else did. If he stopped her now, the questions would only become louder. If he allowed her forward, the answers might become impossible to contain. The arena seemed to hold its breath. The music had faded away. The applause was gone. Even the production crew had frozen. Thousands of people watched as Nia Brooks climbed the staircase one measured step at a time. And for the first time that evening, the future Ethan Blackwell came to unveil was no longer the center of attention. The silence inside the arena felt almost unnatural. Only minutes earlier the room had been alive with music, applause, and celebration. Now thousands of people watched without speaking as Nia Brooks reached the top of the staircase and stepped onto the stage. The bright lights that had once belonged entirely to Ethan now illuminated both of them. Cameras pivoted in unison. Phone screens glowed across the audience like scattered stars. Reporters leaned forward in their seats. Investors exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody understood exactly what was happening, but everyone sensed they were witnessing something important. Nia stopped several feet from Ethan. Between them stood 5 years of unanswered questions. Neither moved. Neither looked away. The giant screens behind them continued displaying promotional graphics for several long seconds before a confused technician finally froze the presentation. The colorful animations disappeared. A simple company logo remained suspended above the stage. Ethan kept his voice low. "Nia, we can discuss this privately." She looked at him for a moment. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. Simply with the calm certainty of someone who had already considered every possible outcome. "Private conversations are how this began," she said softly. The words carried farther than she expected. Nearby microphones caught them. The audience heard enough. A ripple moved through the room. Ethan glanced toward the crowd. He could feel control slipping away from the carefully orchestrated evening. For years he had managed every message, every interview, every appearance. Yet no public relations strategy existed for this moment. Nia slowly lifted the leather folder. The simple gesture seemed to draw every eye in the building. Even the photographers stopped moving. "I did not come here to embarrass anyone," she said. "I came because the story being told tonight is incomplete." The room remained silent. Somewhere in the audience, a phone slipped from someone's hand and landed softly against the carpet. Nia opened the folder. The sound of paper turning echoed strangely beneath the towering ceiling. She removed a single document and held it carefully. Not dramatically, not theatrically, the way a scientist might handle something valuable, something precise, something true. Ethan's eyes immediately settled on the page. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. Nia noticed it. So did several people close enough to see him clearly. 5 years ago, she said, a patent application was filed for the adaptive learning architecture that became the foundation of everything being presented tonight. Several journalists immediately began typing notes. Investors shifted in their seats. Members of Blackwell Dynamics' executive team looked increasingly uncomfortable. Nia continued. The original filing was submitted before the company reached its first major funding round. Before the media attention. Before the expansion. Before any of this. She gestured gently toward the massive stage surrounding them. The audience remained completely still. Even the cameras seemed quieter now. Nia looked down at the document one final time before lifting it slightly higher. "This is the original filing." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Only for a second. But it happened. Nia turned the page toward him first. Then toward the audience. Most people sitting hundreds of feet away could not read it. Yet the cameras could. And cameras were everywhere. One photographer zoomed in. Another did the same. Television crews immediately focused their lenses on the document. Within seconds, the image appeared on production monitors throughout the venue. A technician backstage stared at the screen in disbelief. Nia's voice remained steady. This patent established ownership of the core architecture that made the system possible. She paused. The silence deepened. Then she spoke the words that changed the atmosphere inside the arena forever. "And the primary inventor listed on that filing is Nia Brooks." For a moment, nothing happened. The statement seemed too large for the room to process. Thousands of people simply stared. Then whispers began. Quiet at first. Then louder. Journalists checked notes. Investors looked toward one another. Several members of the audience pulled up public records on their phones. Ethan stood motionless beneath the stage lights. The giant screens still displayed the company logo above him. Yet suddenly it felt much smaller than before. Nia lowered the document carefully. She did not smile. She did not celebrate. She simply allowed the truth to exist in the open air. The crowd no longer looked at Ethan the same way. They looked at both of them. And for the first time in 5 years, the woman who had been erased from the story was standing where nobody could ignore her. The whispers spread faster than the presentation ever could. Within seconds, the atmosphere inside the arena transformed from celebration into uncertainty. Reporters who had arrived expecting a product launch were suddenly chasing a completely different story. Screens across the media section lit up as journalists searched public databases, patent archives, and corporate filings. The soft tapping of keyboards mixed with the growing murmur of thousands of voices. Nia remained exactly where she stood. The document rested calmly in her hands. She did not rush to explain. She did not fill the silence. The truth had a way of demanding attention all by itself. Ethan could feel it happening around him. For years he had learned how to command a room. Tonight, for the first time in a very long time, the room was moving beyond his control. One of the senior investors seated near the front row leaned toward a colleague. Both stared at their phones. Another executive from Blackwell Dynamics quietly stepped away from his seat and moved toward the side of the stage. Several members of the board exchanged worried looks. The confidence that had filled the arena only minutes earlier was beginning to crack. Nia looked toward the giant screens suspended above them. "The document is real," she said. "The filing date is real. The registration number is real. The inventor record is real." Her voice remained composed. Every word sounded measured, deliberate, impossible to dismiss as emotion or accusation. Ethan finally stepped forward. "Nia," he said quietly. There are legal processes for discussing these matters. A few audience members nodded instinctively. It sounded reasonable, professional, corporate. Yet Nia's expression never changed. There were legal processes, she replied. I followed them. Another ripple moved through the audience. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. He understood what she was doing. She was not making claims. She was presenting facts. Facts were much harder to defend against. Nia reached into the folder again. This time she removed a second document, then a third. The papers looked ordinary beneath the bright stage lights. Yet somehow they felt heavier than everything surrounding them. More important than the massive screens. More important than the dazzling presentation. More important than the billion-dollar launch itself. 5 years ago, she continued, I accepted that I could not control the story people told about me, but I could control the records I kept. Several reporters immediately raised their heads. Those words mattered. Nia turned toward the audience. Every design revision was archived. Every development milestone was documented. Every technical submission was preserved. The room grew even quieter. Somewhere near the center section, a journalist stood up entirely, trying to get a clearer view. Camera operators zoomed closer. Livestream comment sections exploded with speculation. Millions of people watching remotely were now asking the same question. If Nia was telling the truth, what else had been left out of the story? Backstage, executives from Blackwell Dynamics gathered around production monitors. Nobody seemed certain what to do. Canceling the event would create panic. Removing Nia would look worse. Continuing the presentation had become almost impossible. Every option carried consequences. Ethan looked toward the frozen company logo still hanging above the stage. He suddenly remembered something Nia had once told him years ago in that garage outside Austin. The technology only works when the system remembers its original source. At the time, they had been discussing software architecture. Tonight, the words felt uncomfortably personal. Nia took a slow breath. I am not here because I want attention, she said. I spent 5 years avoiding attention. That much was true. Nobody had seen her on television. Nobody had seen her accepting awards. Nobody had seen her building a public image. While Ethan became famous, she had quietly continued working. I am here because people deserve to know how this began. A long silence followed. Not hostile, not chaotic, just heavy. Thousands of people listening. Thousands of people reconsidering assumptions they had never questioned before. Ethan looked at her differently now. Not as an interruption. Not as a problem to manage. As a reality he could no longer postpone. The bright lights reflected across the stage floor. The giant screens remained frozen. The cameras never stopped recording. Then, from somewhere near the media section, a reporter spoke loudly enough to be heard. Do you have proof beyond the patent? The question hung in the air. Hundreds of heads turned back toward Nia. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, because unlike everyone else in the room, he already knew the answer. Nia looked down at the folder in her hands. Then she looked up at the audience. Yes, she said softly. That is why I came. The question lingered in the air long after the reporter finished speaking. Do you have proof beyond the patent? Hundreds of faces remained fixed on Nia. Thousands more watched through live streams, waiting for her answer. The arena had become impossibly quiet. Even the executives standing backstage seemed frozen in place. Nia lowered her eyes toward the folder for a brief moment. Then she opened it again. The movement was simple, but it carried a weight that everyone in the room could feel. Ethan watched without speaking. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew what she was about to reveal. The only uncertainty was how much she had preserved. Nia removed a thin flash drive and held it between her fingers. It looked insignificant beneath the bright stage lights. A small object, barely noticeable, yet the reaction it produced was immediate. Ethan's shoulders stiffened. One member of the board quietly sat down. Another executive reached for his phone. Nia noticed all of it. 5 years ago, she said calmly, when I realized my role in the company was being rewritten, I stopped arguing. Her voice echoed softly through the arena. Instead, I started documenting. The giant screens above them remained frozen on the company logo. Nia turned toward the production team near the side of the stage. May I use the display? The request sounded polite, almost ordinary. Yet nobody moved immediately. They all looked toward Ethan. For years, every major decision inside Blackwell Dynamics had flowed through him. Tonight was no different. Ethan stared at the flash drive. Then he glanced toward the audience. Cameras were everywhere. Refusing the request would only raise more questions. Slowly, he nodded. The production manager hesitated before signaling to a technician. A few moments later, one of the giant screens shifted from the company logo to a blank display. The audience leaned forward. Reporters lifted phones. Livestream viewership numbers continued climbing. Nia walked toward a presentation console near the edge of the stage. She inserted the drive. The screen flickered once. Then a directory appeared. Hundreds of files. Hundreds of dates. Hundreds of records. A visible archive stretching back years. The audience reacted instantly. The room filled with whispers once again. Nia selected a folder labeled Austin Prototype Archive. The name alone sent a memory rushing through Ethan's mind. The garage. The whiteboards. The endless nights of work. The screen opened. Inside were development logs, technical drafts, engineering notes, and recorded project reviews. Each file carried timestamps, names, revisions, histories, the kind of details that are difficult to manufacture and even harder to erase. Nia opened one of the earliest design documents. The file appeared across screens towering above the audience. At the top of the page were two names: Ethan Blackwell, Nia Brooks. The crowd fell silent again. Nia opened another file, then another. Every document told the same story: shared development, shared innovation, shared authorship. Reporters typed furiously. Investors exchanged increasingly concerned looks. The atmosphere had changed completely now. This was no longer a disagreement. It was evidence. Nia selected a video file next. The screen went dark for a moment before footage appeared. The recording quality was rough, the lighting uneven, yet the image was unmistakable. A younger Ethan stood inside the Austin garage, discussing technical architecture beside Nia. Whiteboards filled the walls. Coffee cups cluttered the desks. The audience watched as Ethan pointed toward a diagram. Nia solved the adaptive learning bottleneck, his younger voice said. Without her breakthrough, none of this works. A collective murmur swept through the arena. The video lasted only 20 seconds. But 20 seconds was enough. Nia closed the file. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. The room simply absorbed what it had seen. Ethan lowered his gaze. Hearing his own words from years earlier felt different now. Honest. Unfiltered. Recorded before investors arrived. Before consultants shaped narratives. Before public relations teams refined history into something easier to sell. Nia remained composed. I did not save these files because I expected revenge, she said quietly. I saved them because I believed facts matter. The statement landed harder than any accusation could have. Across the front rows, several investors were already consulting attorneys. Phones buzzed continuously. News alerts began appearing online. Articles were being written in real time. Social media feeds exploded with clips from the stage. The story was spreading far beyond the walls of the arena. Nia looked toward Ethan. For the first time that evening, something passed between them that the audience could not fully understand. Not anger. Not triumph. Recognition. A shared awareness that the past had finally arrived. The giant screens continued displaying documents and archived records behind them. Thousands of eyes remained fixed on the evidence. And for the first time since she stepped onto the stage, nobody was asking whether Nia Brooks belonged in the story. The only question left was how much of the story still remained untold. The effect was immediate. Not dramatic in the way movies portray collapse, but far more realistic and far more dangerous. Confidence began evaporating. Across the front rows, investors who had arrived expecting celebration now stared at their screens with growing concern. Phones vibrated continuously. Messages arrived faster than they could read them. Financial analysts monitoring the event remotely began publishing updates. Reporters pushed breaking news alerts to editors. Social media platforms flooded with clips from the stage. Within minutes, the narrative surrounding Blackwell Dynamics had changed. The product launch was no longer the headline. The evidence was. Ethan could see it happening in real time. For years, he had watched markets react to product announcements, acquisitions, and earnings reports. Tonight, he watched something entirely different. He watched trust begin to fracture. A board member standing near the front quietly stepped away and took a call. Another followed. Several major investors gathered into small clusters, speaking in urgent whispers. Their expressions revealed the same concern. Not outrage. Not panic. Uncertainty. And uncertainty was often more dangerous than either. Nia remained calm as the arena shifted around her. She did not add dramatic accusations. She did not attack anyone. The documents continued speaking for themselves. On the giant screens behind her, development records remained visible. Timestamps, revisions, technical notes, proof. The simplicity of it made everything more powerful. Ethan finally looked toward the audience. He noticed faces he recognized from years of partnerships and negotiations. People who had trusted him. People who had invested in his vision. For the first time that evening, he saw questions in their eyes. Questions he could not immediately answer. The host who had opened the event now stood off stage, uncertain whether to intervene. Production staff exchanged nervous glances. Nobody had prepared for this scenario. The carefully scripted presentation had vanished completely. The room belonged to the truth now. A financial journalist near the front raised her voice. "Mr. Blackwell, were you aware these records existed?" Hundreds of heads turned toward him. Ethan stood beneath the lights, suddenly feeling the weight of every camera pointed in his direction. 5 years earlier, he might have answered instantly. Tonight, he hesitated. That hesitation alone generated another wave of whispers, because silence often revealed more than words. Nia looked at him, but said nothing. She was not trying to trap him. She was giving him something she had not been given years ago, a chance to speak honestly. The giant arena seemed to shrink around him. The bright lights felt harsher now. The stage felt smaller. Ethan remembered the meeting in San Francisco. The attorneys, the investors, the promises of growth. He remembered convincing himself that difficult compromises were necessary. He remembered telling himself the company would eventually create opportunities for everyone. He remembered believing that success would somehow justify the choices made along the way. Standing there now, those explanations sounded weaker than they once had. Another reporter spoke. Were these contributions disclosed during funding negotiations? More phones lifted into the air. More cameras zoomed closer. The questions were multiplying faster than answers. Backstage, legal advisors were already arriving. Executives moved through corridors speaking urgently into headsets. News networks interrupted scheduled programming. Online articles updated by the minute. What began as a product launch was becoming one of the biggest corporate stories of the year. Yet in the center of it all stood two people who remembered when none of this existed. Ethan looked toward Nia. For a brief moment, he saw not the woman standing on stage, but the woman in the garage years ago. The one who challenged assumptions. The one who solved problems nobody else could solve. The one who stayed until sunrise when systems failed. The one whose name had slowly disappeared from the story. A realization settled over him with uncomfortable clarity. The evidence was not what frightened him most. The evidence could be reviewed, debated, examined. What frightened him was that the audience was beginning to understand something deeper. This was not merely a dispute about paperwork. It was a question about integrity, about who received credit, about who got remembered. Nia gently closed the folder. The sound was almost lost beneath the growing murmur of the crowd. Yet somehow it drew attention. She looked out across thousands of faces. Investors, employees, journalists, students, engineers, people who had come searching for the future. "I did not come here to destroy a company," she said quietly. The room fell silent once again. "I came because innovation deserves honesty." Her words settled over the audience like a weight. No anger, no revenge, just truth. And in that moment, many people realized the story was becoming larger than either of them. Because the real question was no longer whether Nia Brooks belonged in the history of Blackwell Dynamics. The real question was how many other parts of that history had never been told. The silence that followed Nia's statement felt heavier than any applause that had filled the arena earlier that evening. Innovation deserves honesty. The words lingered beneath the towering ceiling while thousands of people processed what they had witnessed. For years, Blackwell Dynamics had represented certainty, growth, vision, success. Tonight, certainty had become questions. Ethan stood motionless near the center of the stage. The bright lights still illuminated him, but something had changed. The confidence that usually surrounded him like armor seemed thinner now. Not gone, just exposed. Across the front rows, members of the board were no longer pretending to watch passively. Several had gathered together. Quiet conversations became urgent discussions. Attorneys exchanged messages. Financial advisors reviewed documents. The launch event had transformed into something else entirely. One board member, Margaret Holloway, finally rose from her seat. She had served on the board for nearly a decade and was known for avoiding public statements whenever possible. Tonight, she stepped forward. Her expression remained professional, but concern was impossible to hide. "Mr. Blackwell," she said, her voice carrying through a nearby microphone. "Have these materials been previously disclosed to the board?" The question landed with remarkable force because everyone understood its significance. This was no longer about public perception. It was about governance, accountability, responsibility. Ethan looked toward her. For a moment, he seemed older than he had earlier that evening. The years, the pressure, the decisions, all of it appeared visible beneath the stage lights. He could have offered a carefully crafted answer. He had spent years mastering that skill. But something about the room had changed. Something about Nia's presence made rehearsed responses feel inadequate. "Not completely," he answered. A wave of whispers moved through the audience. Margaret did not react emotionally. "Then the board will need to review all relevant records immediately." Another board member nodded in agreement. Then another. Within seconds, what had begun as a single concern became a consensus. Independent review. Internal investigation. Full examination of historical filings. The language remained professional, but the meaning was unmistakable. Blackwell Dynamics would have to look backward before it could move forward. Nia listened quietly. She had imagined many versions of this moment over the years. Some involved anger. Some involved confrontation. None looked exactly like reality. Reality was quieter, more complicated, less satisfying in some ways, more meaningful in others. Because this was not about punishment. It was about acknowledgement. Across the arena, reporters began broadcasting live updates. News alerts flashed across phones nationwide. Market analysts interrupted coverage to discuss the implications. Employees of Blackwell Dynamics watching remotely exchanged messages with colleagues. Many were hearing Nia's name for the first time. Others remembered it vaguely from the earliest days of the company. A software engineer seated halfway back in the audience suddenly remembered seeing old archived documents years ago that referenced her contributions. Another employee remembered hearing stories from veteran staff members who had been present during the startup days. Small fragments of forgotten history were beginning to reconnect. Ethan looked toward the giant screens. The evidence remained displayed behind him. Files, dates, records, facts. He realized something uncomfortable. The truth had been visible all along. Not hidden, not destroyed, simply ignored. Ignored because success moved faster than reflection. Ignored because nobody wanted to question a winning story, including him, especially him. Nia closed the folder completely and held it against her side. She had presented what she came to present. Nothing more, nothing less. One reporter raised a hand, then another. Questions were coming from every direction now. Yet before anyone else could speak, Margaret addressed the room once more. Effective immediately, the board will conduct a full review of the historical development and ownership records associated with the company's foundational technologies. The statement triggered another explosion of activity throughout the arena. Journalists typed frantically. Investors exchanged worried looks. Employees stared at the stage. For many people, this announcement represented uncertainty. For Nia, it represented something she had waited years to hear. Not victory, recognition. The difference mattered. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly. Then he looked toward Nia. Their eyes met across the stage. Neither smiled. Neither celebrated. Because both understood that the hardest part was not exposing the truth. The hardest part would be living with it afterward. The lights continued shining. Cameras continued recording. Thousands of people continued watching. Yet for the first time all evening, the future no longer seemed like the most important thing in the room. The past had finally been allowed to speak, and nobody could pretend they had not heard it. Nearly an hour after the event had begun, the Aurora Dome looked nothing like the place that had welcomed guests earlier that evening. The excitement had not disappeared. It had transformed. Reporters still filled the aisles. Cameras still recorded every movement. But now the atmosphere carried a different energy. Reflection instead of celebration. Questions instead of certainty. On stage, members of the board quietly departed to begin emergency meetings. Legal advisors moved through side corridors. Executives spoke in hushed tones. The machinery of a billion-dollar corporation had shifted into crisis management. Yet for Ethan Blackwell, the noise around him seemed increasingly distant. He stood alone near the edge of the stage while technicians slowly powered down portions of the presentation. The massive screens that had been designed to introduce the future now displayed only a neutral company background. For the first time all evening, there was nothing left to hide behind. Nia had already begun gathering her materials. The folder was closed. The flash drive was packed away. Her purpose for coming had been fulfilled. She had not demanded ownership. She had not demanded money. She had not demanded public humiliation. She had simply placed the truth where everyone could see it. As she turned toward the staircase, Ethan finally spoke. Nia. His voice was quieter than before. Not the voice of a chief executive addressing investors. Not the voice of a public figure speaking to cameras. Just a man speaking to someone he had once known. Nia stopped, but did not immediately turn around. The lights above them had dimmed slightly. Most of the audience remained seated, curious to see what would happen next. Even the reporters sensed this moment was different. They lowered microphones. They listened. Ethan took several steps forward. For a few seconds he searched for words and found none. That alone felt strange. He had spent years explaining strategies, defending decisions, and persuading rooms full of people. Yet the person standing in front of him required something different. Honesty. I told myself I was protecting the company, he finally said. Nia remained silent. Ethan looked down briefly before continuing. At first, every compromise seemed temporary. Every decision felt necessary. Investors wanted simplicity. Advisors wanted a single face. The company kept growing. And each time I thought I would fix it later. The confession was not dramatic. It was tired. The kind of truth that arrives years after it should have. Nia slowly turned toward him. She studied his face. The confidence that had defined him for so long seemed replaced by something else. Regret. Did you ever plan to tell the truth? She asked. Ethan did not answer immediately. That hesitation became the answer. Nia nodded once. Not because she was surprised. Because she already knew. Around them, the arena remained remarkably quiet. Thousands of people watched two former partners standing beneath fading stage lights. The billion-dollar product launch had become something nobody expected. A public reckoning. Ethan exhaled slowly. I should have fought harder. The words sounded small compared to everything that had happened. Yet they were real. I should have said your name when people asked how this started. I should have corrected the story the first time it was wrong. Nia listened without interruption. Years earlier, she might have wanted those words. Years earlier, they might have changed everything. Now they felt different. Necessary. But late. The hardest part was not losing credit, she said softly. The hardest part was watching people believe I was never there. Ethan lowered his gaze. There was no defense for that. No explanation that could undo it. The silence between them stretched for several seconds. Yet it was not hostile. It was simply honest. For the first time in years, neither of them was pretending. Beyond the stage, audience members began quietly leaving their seats. Some headed toward exits. Others remained. Conversations started again. The night was moving forward. Life always did. Nia adjusted the folder beneath her arm. I did not come here because I hate you, Ethan. Those words caught him off guard. She continued before he could respond. If I hated you, I would have done this years ago. I came because I finally realized something. Ethan looked at her. What? Nia's expression softened slightly. The truth does not need permission to exist. The words settled over him. Simple. Unavoidable. True. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Nia turned toward the staircase once more. And this time Ethan did not try to stop her. He simply watched as the woman whose name had been removed from the story walked away with her dignity intact, leaving him alone beneath the lights to face everything the truth had finally revealed. 3 months later, the headlines looked very different. The frenzy that followed the event had eventually faded, replaced by investigations, reviews, and long conversations that could no longer be avoided. Independent auditors examined records stretching back to the earliest days of Blackwell Dynamics. Board committees reviewed development archives. Legal teams verified filings. Journalists followed every update. Through it all, one fact remained unchanged. The foundational patent records were authentic. The contribution history was real. And the name that had been missing for years officially returned to the story. Nia Brooks never celebrated publicly. She declined television interviews. She ignored offers for exclusive documentaries. She turned down speaking tours and media campaigns. To many people, that decision seemed strange. After all, she finally had the recognition she deserved. But recognition had never been the destination. The work always mattered more than the spotlight. On a quiet spring morning in Denver, Nia stood inside a research facility she had spent years building. Sunlight poured through large windows overlooking the Rocky Mountains in the distance. Engineers moved through open workspaces. Whiteboards covered with equations lined the walls. The atmosphere reminded her of something she had not felt in a very long time. Possibility. Not because she had won, because she was free. Her new organization focused on ethical artificial intelligence research, educational partnerships, and technology accessibility programs. Young engineers from across the country competed for internships there. Universities requested collaborations. Investors approached regularly. Nia accepted only the partnerships that aligned with her principles. She had learned what happened when growth became more important than truth. She had no intention of repeating that lesson. Across the country, Blackwell Dynamics was changing as well. Following the board's review, the company formally amended historical records to acknowledge Nia's role in the creation of its foundational technologies. Internal policies were rewritten. Credit attribution systems were strengthened. Research teams received greater transparency protections. The changes did not erase the past, but they represented an effort to learn from it. Ethan Blackwell remained with the company, though his role looked different than before. The months following the launch had forced him to confront questions he spent years avoiding. Some days were uncomfortable. Some conversations were difficult. Yet for the first time in a long time, he stopped measuring success only through growth charts and market valuations. One afternoon, he sat alone in the original Austin garage. The building had been preserved as part of the company's history. Dust floated through beams of sunlight. Old photographs hung on the walls. Prototype equipment remained displayed behind glass. Tour groups occasionally visited. Today the space was empty. Ethan walked slowly through the room, stopping in front of a faded whiteboard covered with handwritten notes from years ago. 2 sets of handwriting filled the surface. His and Nia's. For several minutes, he simply stood there, looking, remembering, understanding. Success had given him almost everything he thought he wanted. But somewhere along the way, he had confused ownership with achievement. The realization arrived late. Yet it arrived. Several weeks later, an invitation arrived at Nia's office. A national technology foundation planned to recognize innovators whose contributions had significantly advanced the field of artificial intelligence. This time, her name appeared first. During the ceremony, there were no dramatic speeches, no emotional confrontations, no public revenge. Nia stepped onto the stage, accepted the award, and looked out across the audience. Students, researchers, entrepreneurs, dreamers, people who would build the future. The applause filled the room. Warm, genuine, earned. She thought briefly about the journey that brought her there. The garage in Austin, the long nights, the silence, the years of being forgotten. Then she thought about something else. None of those experiences defined her. They shaped her, but they did not define her. What defined her was what she chose to build afterward. As the applause continued, Nia smiled softly. Not because justice had finally arrived, not because history had been corrected, but because she no longer needed either one to know her value. The truth had found its place. Her name had found its place. And perhaps that was the real victory. Not taking something away from another person, simply reclaiming what had always belonged to her. The future that everyone came to celebrate that night in Las Vegas had eventually arrived after all. It just looked very different than anyone expected. Because in the end, the most important invention was never the technology itself. It was the courage to tell the truth before success made people forget where it came from.